Welcome back to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. We are now going to pivot. We're going to sort of amplify or shift gears on our housing conversation, acknowledging our housing emergency, and move from construction costs and really understanding everything involving, more fully understanding our construction cost challenge, to real beginning to understand housing financing. And we have three fabulous people here today to help us appreciate that, not just for our two new members who are new to this committee, but for just a good reminder for all of us who don't live with this every day, to appreciate the incredible complexity and all the partners that need to be brought to bear to build the projects that we're now so dependent on building ASAP. So we welcome Maura Collins. I believe you know everybody on the committee. You've already been in, and we give it to you to take it away.
I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. I started this morning with some good-natured teasing of Senator Chittenden, and now I'd like to similarly reprimand this committee for asking for us to cover housing finance within an hour. So that's just a flag that we will be keeping
if it was enough time.
We will be keeping this at a very high level. And for those in YouTube world, I know I'm not doing this justice to explain 120 years of history, but I'm going to jump in. This first slide has already been discussed in your earlier testimony about, you were talking about the cost of housing. I just wanted to point out this graphic on the left that there is more than just development when talking about the cost of housing. There is pre-development, there's operating the housing, which was touched on with some energy conversations, but also support services and how to make sure that the housing works for the tenants. But you will hear phrases as we talk about the development costs, like the hard costs, which were spoken about, but also the soft costs. It's easier to compare hard costs to hard costs. You know, that's like how much was the land, how much were the materials, the labor, all that. And then the soft costs are where sometimes there's more variability, as well as the types of reserves that are required. Private market or market rate housing needs to have reserves that match what the lender expects. Government programs may come with higher and different reserves in certain ways as a way of protecting this. If you want to click the link at the bottom of this slide, though, you would find a great HUD report. This ugly piece of cake that I would never eat is something I put up often to remind you that as the cost of housing increases, we are not able to grow the pie to make it bigger. What we're actually often doing is, as costs go up, we just have to layer in more resources, and we still have the same 12-inch piece of cake, and it just got more and more toxic based on those colors.
But for the record, it's a beautiful piece of gay rainbow cake.
Yes,
definitely.
Yes. So I have made a very short list of funding, and I put in parentheses using a Vermont-based report, roughly how much comes in for each of the programs listed on the left here. Just so you know, you all do require the housing funders in the state to annually create a housing budget and investment report. The link is at the bottom to the most recent one, but you can go back to 2014 and see how much state and federal resources have gone into housing creation as well as operating. AHS numbers are in there of what supports housing. There was a decision several years ago to not include the unique stimulus money, the ARPA money that went to housing. We wanted it to be a little more apples to apples over the years of how much the state was putting into housing. The one-time funds that went to VHCB are included, but not the ARPA resources. So, or CARES Act resources from 2020. So just know that there actually was a little more than what you see in that report. But you can see from the most recent report, the first, I put it in italics, the congressionally directed spending, because that was the last year that we had the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Senate Appropriations in Congress for us. And so there was an unusually large CDS dedicated to housing that year, although there often are some smaller, congressionally directed spending. But you can see that the Community Development Block Grant Program, which doesn't just pay for housing, also pays for some economic development, is there. The home program, there was a one-time special home program that came out of ARPA that's mentioned there. So that was $8 million, not every year, but one time that's being doled out over a year or two. There's other federal funds that you can see, like Section 811 is for people with disabilities. Section 202 is just housing for elders. Those are competitive. Vermont developers apply for those and rarely get them. It does not come in annually. Same with some multifamily assistance. There are other funding that create these layers of the cake. There's energy money for energy efficiency utilities, as well as now there's some IRA, Inflation Reduction Act opportunities, deferred developer fees. Developers put money into the deal of their earnings as a source of funding when they don't pencil, as well as the Federal Home Loan Bank system has an affordable housing program.
So question for you. So here are all these funding opportunities, some realities. Where does that federal money get deposited? How does it come to us? And how did it access?
The last page of this link gives you a pretty graphic of largely of the state's 4 housing funders and which of these programs we each administer. I happen to know off the top of my head, I don't know if that would be helpful. I think the graphic would be better where you can see that VHFA does the lending through the bonds, which I'll talk about, and the tax credits, which is really my focus here. VHCB does the state investments largely, as well as the home program and the National Housing Trust Fund. And then the Department of Housing and Community Development largely does the Community Development Block Grant and the administers the historic preservation tax credits. And then you have a state housing authority that does the ongoing operating rental assistance of the Section 8s. A lot of the other programs listed here, like the Section 811, 202, and USDA, that comes straight from the feds, and there's not a state level entity that is the intermediary there. Which all this does get a bit to my point, which is the more you make this cake taller, it does get more complex and complicated. And we did do a study a few years ago, which I'll talk about in a second.
Harder to eat.
That does, it can add to the cost. You have to imagine if each of these programs are government programs, they each have rules and regulations, they each have standards, they each make us count income a little differently, calculate rent a little differently. So the compliance of all this is very complicated. You saw this graphic before when I came in and explained to you what and who VHFA is. I said that we borrow money from investors and we loan it out and we get paid back and then we pay back the investors. What I didn't tell you was that what that concept is called, that tax exempt borrowing, is a tax exempt private activity bond. If you've ever watched the e-board meet, you know that every year they have an allocation in the state to allocate the private activity bonds between VHFA, the Vermont Bond Bank, the Vermont State Student Assistance Corporation, VSAC, and VITA, the Economic Development Authority. And we all jokingly thumb wrestle over who gets this bond authority cap. It's capped based on our per capita number. And we divvy it up, and then our allocation means we can spend that much in bonding authority each year. And the others have their bonding authority. Back when VSAC was a very active student loan lender, they used a lot of this, and in other states there's tension about how much is used for housing versus other uses. When the feds took over a lot of the student loan lending, VSAC's need for this resource decreased a bit, and now there's enough money largely to go around for the state of Vermont. Why am I telling you about private activity bonds and lending when I really want to tell you about tax credits? Because to go back, I'm going to be jumping around a lot. See the orange, low income housing tax credits? This is a federal program that's the 5th largest tax expenditure in the nation. Okay, so this is a big cost to the feds. And as you can see here with 41 million in the most recent year, it tremendously outstrips a lot of these smaller HUD programs that you see, as well as not strip what the state's investments can be. So this is a big program that is helpful to understand. The feds don't make it easy because they call it LIHTC, low income housing tax credits. I'm going to say LIHTC from now on. They call it the one name, but there's two versions of this program. There's a 4% version and a 9% version. This is where I don't want to lose you because it's very important. So I'm happy to answer questions. Both types of LIHTC, both types of tax credits build the same housing. It's rental housing. It is for people earning under 60% of the median income. The rules are the same. The benefits to the investors are the same. It is one program when you think about what gets created with this resource. It also is the same thing, regardless of 4 or 9%, about who can access this and what they can do with it and how they turn it into money. The difference is that number 9 is more than twice as much as 4. So I'm not going to explain to you how to calculate a tax credit, but I am going to tell you that at the end of the deal, the developer gets twice as much money if we give them a 9% tax credit versus a 4% tax credit. So everyone wants the 9s, okay? It's twice as much money. If I had a pie chart of what it costs to build a building, if I had a 9% tax credit award from VHFA's board, I would probably be able to fill about 70% of what I need with that one program. Now I only have to find 30% of what I need from that funny looking cake. Okay, it's probably going to take fewer resources, theoretically. If I get awarded a 4% tax credit, I'm only able to fill 35% of what I need. I now have to fill the other 65% with that layered cake. I got to go around and get a lot more money. And so everyone wants the 9s, the 4s are less valuable. The difference is when it says how to receive, the 9% are competitive. We only have $32 million to hand out, and we always have more than twice as many applications as we do money available. And even that, I'll explain to you why. If we had a lower threshold to apply, we would get a lot more applications. But it's very competitive. Meanwhile, the 4% credits, which don't get you as far, those are virtually unlimited. That, we have tons of them. We could do more. I'm telling you right now. If we had more, I'm going to tell you why we're not doing them all, but we are not using all the 4% tax credits that we could. And the reason is how are they automatic and why are they not competitive? It's because they are automatic if a developer takes the project they're going to build, and if they choose to borrow to pay for that building, and half that building is paid for by the bonds, the private activity bonds that VHFA administers. So going back to this thing, if they choose to borrow from us and use this system for at least half of their development, then they are automatically going to get the 4% credits, and they're going to get that 35% of what they need in terms of tax credits.
So if they meet a threshold, this is automatic.
And the threshold is they have to borrow to pay for half of their construction with the private activity bonds that we administer. So what happens? They often do it at construction. They say, it's going to take me $10 million to build this building. I want a $5.5 million loan because they got to get over that 50% test. They're going to take a $5.5 million loan from us. During the next 18 months, they pay back that loan. And by the time they're closing, they've been deemed eligible for these credits. And now they've sold the credits and the investor has shown up with that money. And that's a source for this project. So you can see the benefit is the 4% is only going to cover about half as much of the development costs as the 9% credits. But the good part is that it's unlimited versus we have a very limited number of 9%. So since it's unlimited, many years ago, we looked at the rules of what does it take in Vermont to get these credits. We have this plan where we have to tell developers what rules do they have to do to get these credits. We call the Qualified Allocation Plan, QAP. And we went through, and because we wanted to use more of these credits, these 4% credits. We want to make it very easy because they're unlimited and this is a good resource. We essentially stripped out a lot of the extra requirements that Vermont had in there to make sure that we were just focusing on what the IRS rules are. Tax credits are ruled by the IRS. What the IRS rules are to make sure if someone can make these 4% credits work, let's do it. So the only thing we require above what the feds require is that we do look that it's a good site, meaning in a historic settlement pattern. You know, it's a pretty vague term, but we want to make sure that this is some smart growth. We do encourage mixed income developments. We actually have to waive that one a lot of the time because they can't have high income folks and low income folks that, I think that's another whole testimony. We do have an executive order by the governor that requires that if you get any kind of money, you, that 15% of the building is occupied by people who are formerly homeless. We do have some universal design standards and building standards. Otherwise, we try to keep the bar very low for what it takes to get these credits. Because the IRS sets it high enough for us.
Can you refresh my memory? The 32 million for developments and the very sought after 9%. Where is that coming from?
It's the feds.
Okay.
And so it's the IRS, it's through the US Treasury, it goes to the IRS, and it's these tax credits. And I think Kathy is going to talk about how she, as a developer, turns an award of tax credits into cash for her development.
It's the same 32 every year, or does it fluctuate?
It fluctuates a little.
Okay.
We actually had a bump and that bump just went away. We are working with our congressional delegation to try to get that increased dramatically.
So that represents this year, FY 26, 25.
Roughly, yeah.
And so if 32 million is a known number for this year, almost unlimited, what was the number in the almost unlimited amount last year?
I have slides on all that.
Okay.
Yep. So because there's so much value to these 9% credits, and because
I just have
Yep.
one more question on these unlimited, on the 4%. Are you able to stack the 4%?
yeah, with other resources.
No, I know with other
Yeah.
resources, but you can't use more than 4%.
No, it doesn't work that way.
You can't add them up.
No,
Okay,
no.
just.
I know what you're thinking here.
No,
So when I say we get twice as many applications for the 9% credits, that is under the next thing I'm gonna say, which is we do, that blue arrow means we're doing everything that the 4% credits require, meaning following all the IRS rules and doing all those design standards. And we've raised the bar and said, if you want this valuable money, you have to be in a downtown. You have to offer more homeless, like 25% of your units have to be for homeless. You have to offer services to the homeless folks. You have to have deep affordability, take on more debt, have access to transportation, be at risk of loss of housing or assistance. Look at brownfield and site remediation. We prioritize historic preservation. We look at super energy efficient buildings and a lot more. You don't have, it's a menu. You don't have to do all these things in every building, but there's essentially a grading system. And the more of these things you do, the higher you get scored, the more likely in this competitive environment, you're going to get funded. And that makes sense because we have raised the bar to such a high level. And even still, we have more than twice as many applications and we are turning down high quality downtown developments in your communities that you would be really mad at if you realized we were saying no to. But the competition is that stellar. The development happening in Vermont is amazing and they are doing all these things. The professor in me wants to turn the question to you and say, what do you think also happens when you raise the bar that high and ask for a development to do so much?
we maybe have fewer projects.
Price goes.
Price goes up, then we have fewer projects.
So I know we're not still talking about cost.
Oh, well.
I just have to say, tell me what to do here. Do we lower the bar, lower the cost, have 6 times as much demand as resources? Or do we say, you know what, you got the golden lotto ticket here when we're paying for 70% of your building. And you know what? When you're getting federal resources to pay 70% of your building, we actually want you to do all this because there's not going to be a ton of them in Vermont, but where they are linchpin to these communities.
They are.
Let me give you one example of one. My new thing is I feel like the superintendent who has to like come out and cut the football team just to make a point about how I'm going to make my budget. I want to talk about one of these priorities, downtown development. Downtown development is something universally, I do not hear in this building or anywhere else that we're going to cut that one. I do hear some arguments about the homeless services. I hear arguments about the energy standards. I hear arguments about the brownfield remediation. Some people have different opinions about if those should be bars we set or not. Downtowns, so far, I'm not hearing is that you all want us to get rid of that.
No, we're wanting to add to it.
Well, let me tell you 6 ways downtown developments drive up cost.
Right.
They're all unique sites. This isn't a greenfield. This is a weird scale shape. I don't do anything, but developers can't take a design and plop it into 4 different downtown sites because they're all weird shaped, topography, everything. First floor commercial, not a moneymaker, money loser, just so you know. But our downtowns need to walk by a storefront. And so a lot of times that first floor is not generating enough rent to cover its costs. Downtowns are in floodways, floodplains, remediation needed, much more expensive. So unless you're ready to tell me that we're abandoning all our downtowns on the riverside, that adds up cost. Jean Morrissey, who just testified, could also tell you she just did a downtown development in a community where it's very complicated to truck in your materials, truck in your equipment, truck it back out. That takes time. It takes people. Think about, you can't leave an excavator on Main Street in Burlington overnight, nor the stacks of roofing materials. You have to move it, store it, do all that. Alder is dirty, but you need to dig it up. You need to ship it off. Downtowns have very dirty dirt. And lastly, historic preservation is more often found in downtowns than greenfields. That's one policy priority and about 6 different ways that we're driving up cost by having that priority. I'm going to go back to my education.
Is it a moment for Tom to ask his question?
You're leading me to conclude that those priorities might need to be realigned to focus on number of units relative to cost or even timeline scale. Who sets those priorities? Is that the HFA or do we here in the legislature?
It is VHFA the VHFA board through the QAP process, and then the governor signs it. And we're already ahead of you, and we're changing the QAP as we speak, and it is prioritizing costs as we have been. We have not been silent to cost. And actually, what I'm going to talk about is a study we did where we looked at cost and have been addressing this.
And timeline too, just to get the units online faster.
We have one of the criteria is readiness to proceed. So we already prioritize those that can move fast. I just want to make sure everyone knows what we're doing with this tax credit housing. We are serving very low income folks. The median income for a 2-person household is about $82,000, but renters often have lower incomes. So a median renter earns around $43,000, by half of overall households. Our tax credit tenants earn around $17,000 a year. We'd like for you to take some time and figure out a budget living on $17,000 a year. These are folks who cannot afford much for rent. You can see how many have disabilities, who are elderly, some racial breakouts of this. This is very important housing for the few. I talked about a golden ticket in the lottery. The few folks who can get into this housing, it's valuable. These, I need to be very clear because I love my numbers. These pie charts are not based on real numbers. I didn't have time for that, but I wanted to prove a point. So don't quote me on the numbers. But in general, I absolutely stand by the visual effect I have here, which is on the left. You can see that tax credit equity is a big part of 4% deal. That's that 35%. That's a safe number to go by. And the rest of it, this is the colorful cake. It's filled in by federal resources. The project takes on some debt. Developers chip in money. The state through the HCB chips in money. There's other energy stuff, other things, but the gray slice on the left is why we were not using 4% tax credits to build housing, new construction. It's because that gray spot, I don't know where that money was going to come from. It didn't exist, so the projects didn't move forward. We didn't use 4% tax credits for new construction prior to the pandemic, for the most part. We did preservation with 4% tax credits. We took existing affordable housing and we rehabbed it, and their costs were lower because we already owned the building, we owned the land, it was operating, we had tenants and cash flow and reserves. And so we would do preservation with 4% tax credits. But since 2020, 2021 really, something changed. And the state controlled resources went from that light blue color that you gave VHCB to also include one-time money for VHCB and ARPA money. So that light blue got bigger. All of a sudden, something changed and we could use 4% tax credits for new construction like we couldn't before. So this is my final slide because I know I talked too much. And that's that pre-pandemic in 2015 to 2019, VHFA used $82 million for multifamily housing. But since the pandemic, that jumped up to about $270 million, a 230% increase in our private activity bonds for multifamily housing. Now, does anyone remember why I would care, why it matters that we have gone up to $270 million of this private activity bond lending? Because what happens when someone uses that resource? They trigger the automatic 4% tax credits. So the more we can use these boring bonds for multifamily housing, the more 4% tax credits we can use. And the bullet point and the table at the bottom tells you this, which is in those 5 years prior to the pandemic, there was about 31 million in private activity that came in from the tax credits due to the 4% tax credit. And since the pandemic, that's up to 157 million. We are using more federal resources, more private equity, more money for housing, which means we can now, for the first time ever, do new construction using these 4% tax credits. When or if the resources that the state directs drops off a cliff, we will go back to that pre-pandemic reality. We will use the 4% tax credits for preservation. We'll keep housing going. We will use it. We'll have about $30 million that over 5 years that we can do, but we will not be doing new construction with that resource. We'll have it with the 9% credits, but we won't have it with the 4% credits. And I know that I believe Jenny next from VHCB, I think, is going to be speaking about what they've done and some of these projects are. And then I think Kathy's going to talk from the developer perspective. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I also don't want you to use all your steam up on me.
It's sinking in.
Okay.
Any questions for those of us who are taking it all in? David? Okay.
I talk to Maura all the time.
Good morning, everybody. For the record, my name is Jenny Hislop. I'm the Director of Housing for the Housing Conservation Board. And Maura talked with you about what I think of as some of the most powerful tools in housing finance. The 9% and the 4% low-income housing tax credits. And I'll be talking with you about how the housing ecosystem as a whole works together to put those financial powerhouses to work for Vermonters and how funds are awarded to projects and flow. So we're going to dive deeper into the question of how it all works, but I like to always start with the why, and the next two slides are probably familiar to you, and they help me ground in the why. So why are we focused on housing for the most vulnerable? Why do we think permanent affordability is a wise way to steward public investment, and what is the state and the community leveraging when it makes permanent investments? So this story really tells the story, this slide really tells the story broadly of the need for 25 to 35,000 homes around the state. And that's not one need, it's a variety of needs. Not all of these homes have to be affordable to those at the lowest income levels, but that's where we see the most pressing need. And this slide tells us a story of how the need is disproportionately impacting folks who are at the very lowest incomes. And that's people with incomes of up to $30,000 a year. Without a targeted public investment, the market has not been able to meet their needs. And these are the folks who can least afford the construction costs that you heard about this morning. The blue on this slide is the percent of cost burden households. So folks who are spending over 50% of their income on housing. And you can see that that's very heavily skewed at the lowest income levels. And so as funders and developers, our job is to come together to support the kind of projects that we agree will meet the most pressing needs. And we use state dollars to unlock the private equity that Maura described earlier to subsidize the cost of construction and reduce the rents that from a senior, a teacher, a mechanic would need to pay. VHCB is the primary administrator of state housing investments, and we want to do it in a way that meets the state's housing priorities. But we also want to leverage the maximum amount of other non-state resources to provide the most affordable housing possible. And these are some of the partners that we work with to ensure that the housing has capital to be completed, rental assistance to support affordability, and services to support well-integrated communities. At VHCB, we award both state and federal funding to a variety of project types, and we do this through an open and a competitive application process. In that process, we underwrite applications from developers and make recommendations to our board, which makes final commitments. And in the process of doing that, we are always trying to balance speed with the need for leverage. So we're asking ourselves, if we put a little bit more into one project, can we make it move faster? If we put a little less into one project, can we fund another one and keep two projects going? So what you can see on the slide is that the state funds that you give us, including ARPA, that the legislature has appropriated to VHCB, leverage just substantial resources for Vermont. And I'll talk in a minute about what's in that yellow swath. The blue is the resources the legislature has given VHCB. And because we do so many different kinds of projects at so many different price points, it's really hard to give you kind of an average. But what I can say to you is for the last 10 projects that we did using tax credits program that Maura's talking about, we've taken $152,000 per unit in state resources, including ARPA. And with those funds, we've leveraged more than $350,000 in other resources, non-state resources per unit.
So that's the last bullet on there. You take,
Yes.
and but what you don't, what's it? So you've leveraged on that. You've leveraged how much again?
Over 350,000 per unit.
Because you apply 28%
Right.
of the, which is 350. Okay. Thanks.
And so because we're making permanent investments and asking for a permanent stewarding of investments by our applicants, we're looking at a host of factors as we're underwriting applications. We're looking at cost, we're looking at quality, alignment with state priorities, the experience of the owner in managing rental housing. And we're also looking not just at the budget to build, but a 20-year cash flow projection, because we're looking for long-term sustainability in projects that we fund. This morning you talked about costs, and now we're talking about how deals are structured. And I think of this slide as a picture of the connection between the two. So what you see here is some of a wide breadth of the types of investments that VHCB makes using the funds that you've provided to us. On the left are a couple of shelter projects. And then moving across the screen, you'll see a mobile home community, and then a couple of hotel conversions, followed by some of the multifamily tax credit projects. And along the top, that's the cost. Down at the bottom in blue is the VHCB investment. So you'll see that the most expensive projects are the multifamily projects on the right. That's because those projects are creating a whole home rather than converting a hotel room or preserving a manufactured home or creating a shelter bed. But what this tells us is a few things about deal structure. It tells us that when we leverage private equity through the tax credit program to create an apartment, it costs the state about as much as when we invest in a shelter bed. But the investment in the apartment unlocks private equity and other leverage to bring resources needed to Vermont to create a full apartment. So in a shelter, there just aren't as many other sources of leverage. It's a critical need, but it's financed very differently. And these are the three.
Sorry, any
Yes.
questions? Okay.
These are the three most common types of leverage, both as a percent and a dollar amount for the projects that we've funded since 2020. So tax credit, equity, amortizing debt, grants, and fundraising. But there are a lot of, we did a list yesterday of our sources of leverage and it was over 50. So different projects have different types of funding sources in them. And I'll say there are a number of funding types that you'll only see in our more expensive projects, like historic tax credits, brownfield funding. Those types of funding sources are contributing to housing, but they're not available to all projects. But they really do play an important role in helping to offset the high costs of those particular needs, historic preservation, environmental remediation. So VHCB statute calls us to be careful stewards of the fund to get the maximum benefit that we can from every dollar. And one of the ways that we achieve that is through permanent affordability. In exchange for project funding, developers agree to permanently steward projects for the benefit of low and moderate income Vermonters. It's a forever commitment. And when the legal framework of permanent affordability is applied to funding, in my mind, it really is supports community resilience. I think the most important way we saw that during the pandemic was that over 30 years, we've been investing in homes all over the state, permanently affordable homes, more than 15,000 of them all over the state. 1,500 people who had been homeless were housed in those homes. And that would not have been possible without the requirement for permanent affordability and without our investments being lifetime investments for Vermonters.
So over time, VHCB has created over 15,000
Right.
permanent affordable homes. But since the thing of sort of mixing timeframes and over what the 1,500 is since the pandemic.
And the
Yes.
1,500 is that just during the pandemic in homes that were created prior to the pandemic, just as a result of turnover in those mission-driven organizations, somebody would leave an apartment, they would turn it over to somebody who had experienced homelessness. So those are 1,500 families who didn't end up in the hotel voucher program. They never made it there. And so we see the homelessness epidemic and the crisis, it would be much bigger without that resilient network of housing providers. So when Maura talked about the difference between 4 and 9% credits, in my mind, the power of our two organizations working together to rev up those 4% credits during the pandemic has been one of the single most impactful things that I think that the legislature has funded. With state investments, VHCB has provided funding to support more than 25 projects with more than 1,000 units in communities around the state using 4% credits. That's money that would just simply have been left on the table without the state capital available. But because of the state's investment, those units are online and 265 of those units are for people who experienced homelessness. And because of permanent affordability, it's not just the people living in them now, it's every time they turn over, they'll be available to a household experiencing homelessness, saving on a motel voucher program, and also just providing a dignified and decent place to live. So this busy slide is just to give you a sense of the number of different developers around the state that we work with. We work with people in every corner of the state. In the last 5-6 years, we've made investments in more than 140 communities in Vermont. So we work with a lot of folks. And one of my very favorite developers is Kathy, a buyer, and I'm gonna hand it over to her so she can talk with us more about the structure of individual deals.
Thank you.
Anybody has any questions?
Any
for me?
questions for Jenny?
Do you use like a square footage requirement for, family of one,
Right.
to family of X?
So we use market studies to determine need, like per bedroom size, and then our square footage. We do such a wide variety of projects.
Like,
Like, you have like is there a minimum, maximum?
I mean, I wouldn't say that we have a minimum or maximum, but we do have the Gus Seelig test, which is, would you want someone you love to live there?
that is the best.
But we've
But
also
we do,
done,
yes.
we've experimented with all kinds of things. So we've done tiny homes that are just a couple hundred square feet. What I would say to you is when somebody brings us, for the record, apartment sizes that look really small, that's when we ask that question of how are we going to feel at the end of the day? Is it really someplace that somebody is going to be comfortable living in? We are not building, when we're doing 3-bedroom apartments, we're not building 1,500 square feet. They're closer to 1,000.
Yeah,
900.
1,100, yeah.
Yeah, so,
I'm just wondering if, given the escalation in costs and the now, the stated cost of somewhere between 500 to 600,000 per unit, if we're looking at constraining the square footage.
The developers naturally constrain the square footage. In fact, some often, so they will bring us, and as a result, sometimes we have to push back to ensure that household needs are able to be met, because it's obviously less expensive to build a smaller apartment, and they're driven by that as well.
and overall, we're building maybe more 1-bedroom apartments than we would have been 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
Just because that's.
Just because
demographic.
family size is too small.
So, and almost every project will go through a process that Kathy can talk about of value engineering when they get their bids back, because we're all mindful that there's budgets to get that.
Right. So given our time, I'm gonna ask Kathy to come and join us. If we need more time, we'll make it famous for.
Good morning again. The buyer from Stephen North. I'll be back and we're gonna go a little into the weeds on low-income housing tax credit. But more actually first zeroing out on how do we as a community finance rental housing. So Evernorth is a company that's been around for over 30 years, and we work in both Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont in the 3 states as a syndicator of the low-income housing tax credit. And that means we find investors who purchase the low-income housing tax credit, and that is equity that we can then bring into these deals. As a nonprofit real estate developer, we only do that work in Vermont, and it's always in partnership with what we call our regional partners, such as Champlain Housing Trust. This is Bay Ridge Apartments in Shelburne, 68 apartments and 26 home ownership units under construction right now, or Rural Edge in the Kingdom, Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust in Southern Vermont. We work all in every corner of the state. Currently in our partnerships, we have 320 units under construction, total of 122 million construction dollars in play right now. And we have another 349 units in over 13 projects across the state that are in that pre-development stage that we're getting ready to get to a construction closing. I think Maura mentioned this, the low-income housing tax credit is the biggest housing production program of the federal government, and it's in the tax code. Kind of strange, but it was started in 1986 and it has lasted this long with bipartisan support. And it's really kind of the basics of real estate development is that you need to build a capital stack. We talked about costs this morning. Well, now we're going to talk about the capital stack. And that is really always a combination of debt and equity. And in the case of affordable housing, what we say soft sources you can attract to keep the rents affordable. I'm going to give you a very simple example of comparing a market rate transaction to a LIHTC transaction. So in this case, we said arbitrarily a 2-bedroom apartment could rent for $3,000 a month. And believe it or not, that is happening. That is market rent in some communities. But when you use low-income housing tax credit, you have to follow the rules, and the most you can charge for a 2-bedroom apartment is $1,357. We all know this. You then have to pay things like property taxes and insurance. You have operating costs. In this example, I pretended that they are equal in the market apartment versus the affordable. Often affordable housing would have higher costs, particularly if you're trying to have supportive services, if you have a homeless population in your building. But for ease of example, we use the same operating cost. And it's just math. The market side has more cash. When you pay what you have to pay, you have more cash left over to take on a mortgage, right? So in the market rate apartment, the developer can have $255,000 a unit of debt. On the affordable side, you can only bring on $73,000 a unit in debt. The market rate developer still has to finish the capital stack. And that means they still have to go find private equity. And why would an investor put equity into a market rate transaction? Well, they need a return, right? They're going to look to cash flow that comes from the rents. They get tax depreciation. They want to see rents increase over time because that leads to appreciation of the asset. And something that we all call the back end, and it happens in real estate across the country, that a private developer or the investor may say, look, we've owned it for 10 years, 15 years, we want to sell, and that's a way to extract some equity back out of the deal. There's nothing wrong with this model. It's a way that market rate housing gets built, and it gets a return to that equity investor.
I actually met my husband talking to different folks about opportunity zones when they became a thing in 2017, and seeing if they were actually going to help low-income people and economically at-risk communities. I know it's been a really mixed bag, but we have the administration back that thinks of these tools as the ones that might survive freezes and cuts and all kinds of things. So I just wonder if we're poised to take advantage with the private sector of these kinds of tax breaks that might come back into fashion in this administration.
Yeah, I've seen opportunity zones are another federal investment program that may be a way to get more equity into a private deal. It can be. I've seen one deal in Vermont with it. It hasn't been used a lot. But if again, if you need equity into multifamily rental housing, that equity needs a return, and that's a tool to get returned to the investor and have equity in it.
I actually wrote a report for Vermont Community Foundation on opportunity zones in 2017. I'll share with the community.
That would be great. We have how many again in Vermont?
It was like 17 or
11.
something.
Yeah.
There was 3 in Rutland.
Oh,
24, 26.
Same
20, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's census tracts. That doesn't mean 26 towns.
Right. I think it was 17 towns and like 24. Yeah.
So that's the private side. So no surprise, because remember, the affordable housing couldn't take on as much debt. And the only way you're going to be able to have those affordable rents is to replace that model with something that works different. And that is what the low-income housing tax credit does, right? It allows us to increase the debt that we can bring to the capital stack. And in that way, we'll be able to keep the rents affordable. But just as with the private equity investor in the market rate deal, the investor in the LIHTC deal needs a return. They're not going to give you $2.5 million and get zero return. So the return they get is the low-income housing tax credit, and it's a 10-year credit. So they get 10 years of tax credits. That's a dollar for dollar write-up on your taxes. That's the primary return. There's also tax depreciation, which has been used in real estate for a very, very long time. So let's take a look at how this might look in Maura touched on this. how does the developer get the credits? They go to VHFA. VHFA allocates either the 9% or 4% credits. Great. We got the credits. Now it gets a little bit complicated. Bear with me here. Every groundbreaking or ribbon cutting you go to, where you'll see VHFA and VHCB, and it's a LIHTC project. Every single one of them is a separate limited partnership. You'll see the name, Bay Ridge Apartments is a limited partnership, because we need to get that equity investors' dollars into the building. And the way we do that is we set up a limited partnership, and the equity investor is the limited partner that owns 99.99% of the partnership. We have limited partnership agreements that are like 100 pages long, but it's based on the foundation. That limited partner is going to get 99.99% of the tax credits, the tax depreciation, the tax write-offs, and that's how the return gets back to the limited partner. So in this example, if this building got $450,000 of tax credits per year for 10 years, that's 4.5 million, but that's over a 10-year period. So the investor says, well, I'll give you 4 million today if you deliver that stream of tax benefits over the 10-year period. And that's the basics of how you translate the low-income housing tax credits into equity to get into the building. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, it's tax partnerships are used in real estate, in all forms of real estate. So how does this look in reality? This is Riverwalk Apartments in White River Junction. It was completed last year. This was a 9% deal. So it got $892,000 of 9% LIHTC. Again, that's times 10 years. And in this example, the equity was about 50% of the capital stack. More is right. It's often 60 to 70% of the capital stack in a 9% deal. And that just means we didn't have to go shake so many more trees to fill, to finish the capital stack. This is a 4% deal. Kelly's Field in Heinsberg. We are moving people in starting next week. Very excited about that. But a 4% deal has, as said, that credit is less than half of what a 9% can get. So $487,000 a year of tax credits. And in return, we got about 30% equity into the deal. So we had a bigger stack to fill above the equity. I didn't list all the sources here, but in Kelly's Field, I think I counted 14 different sources.
You're kidding. How many compared to?
Riverwalk was probably 8 or 7. But it's not unusual that we are looking at that many different sources. So I went through that maybe too fast, but that is like the basics of how we translate the low-income housing tax credit into equity and into affordable rental housing that we're trying to build all around the state.
Yeah, I'm really glad we did this. We're gonna have to do it several times. And I have to sleep with it under my pillow. It's any
May help you fall asleep.
No, it's the translation that is, I'm there's still some challenges for me. And anybody with question anything, it's
I know it sounds very complicated, and I've been doing it for way too long. But this is the way LIHTC housing is built all across the country. It's all this model. Setting up a separate limited partnership. The investors who come into Evernorth puts together about a $70 million equity fund every year. And that consists largely of banks, about 16 different banks across northern New England. So, and in addition, TD Bank, we have a separate about $40 million equity fund with TD Bank. So one way to think about it is these banks are sitting on capital. They need a place to invest it, and the low-income housing tax credit also meets their CRA requirements, Community Reinvestment Act. So why not get this investment from the banks that otherwise could go to a variety of things? But this is a way to get that cash investment into affordable housing.
But that has a time frame and a timeline that they're not going to want it see tied up for too long because they need it.
It's tied up for in a LIHTC partnership. Remember we talked about on the private market rate, there's a back end, right? The equity investor gets cash back out. In a LIHTC transaction, at least in Vermont, because VHA requires perpetual affordability, there is no back end, and that investor's return is the tax credits and the tax write-offs, and at the end of 15 years they go away. We have a constituent during the distribution.
Yeah. So, yes, well, on that could 7 minutes. So say that one more time. Sorry. The 15 years says it's done, it's finished in 15 years.
The initial, what we call compliance periods, but the equity investor in a LIHTC deal is not getting their return based on a back end, on a cash out. We're going to cash out. We're going to make some money on the appreciation of this multifamily building. That is not their return.
No,
and that's how we have long-term affordability.
Their return is all in tax credits.
Primarily. That's really I mean, like I said, an equity investor needs a return, and in the private side, the return can be from the appreciation from rents, the appreciation of the asset. In a LIHTC deal, you take that is not in the equation, and that is the way we're able to keep rents affordable over time.
So who's the broker on all these deals? I mean, because
there's syndicators across the country. There's very, very big syndicators that are huge that work at the national level, but there's not a lack of syndicators to pull to make this marriage of the investor sitting with the cash and the developer who has tax credits to sell.
If I may, in Vermont, of all the tax credit deals that we award, I would say that Evernorth is a syndicator on probably 70% or more. So they are the largest by far.
Right. In part because we're a rural state, as you've noticed, and some of the national syndicators actually don't have that much interest in small rural, like 30-unit projects. They look at you and they're like, "You said what? 30 units?"
Like, really,
well, yeah, that's the average size. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, David, beautiful. Oh,
Thank
you. And that is because Evernorth is anchored in 3 northern states. Originally 3 northern, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York.
No,
Just Maine.
well, we are
In nonprofit.
the majority of syndicators are private syndicators.
Your public.
We are nonprofit.
You're nonprofit.
So
Right.
we have a mission, particularly a mission of serving what we call the not only rural areas, but underbanked areas. I can tell you we've done underbanked. And I can tell you we've done deals in Wells River, Springfield, could not find an investor for Springfield because banks.
For the Wilson block.
The beautiful Wilson block. So if you are the way banks like to invest where their deposits are. And in some of our more rural communities, there's just not a lot of footprint there for banks.
The
And-
banks have pulled that.
Yeah, so our commitment is to do equity investments in the rural places that a for-profit syndicator might not.
And how many nonprofit syndicators are there?
In the country, there's about 17. I believe.
Yeah, there aren't very many. I mean, that's even two things I can do. Any other questions before we break? Guys,
If I could just add a couple points to what's been presented, first, I just want to credit VHFA because Evernorth would not exist if 35 years ago they hadn't opened their bank accounts and said, we're going to capitalize on nonprofit to do this work, both so we have the statewide expertise to serve every corner of the state. And that was proved immensely wise. Other states that they followed us and how there's a lot of equity and Evernorth in order to deal with bringing more equity to the whole region. Second thing I just want to really put an emphasis on is there is a huge amount of coordination that goes on across our agencies to figure out how to maximize all the federal resources Maura talked about. So while we have often done historic preservation projects for 9% credits in recent years because the additional equity and because there's a historic preservation tax credit, we sometimes use the 4% credit along with the historic credit to make those projects work. So that coordination is going on among our staffs every day. How do we maximize resources? How do we make sure we're meeting the federal deadlines and the compliance? And then just to go to the question Senator Chittenden raised, often with a building that's in a downtown or a historic preservation project, just sort of point on this, there's a source being used like the historic tax credit that would not be available for a greenfield project.
right.
There are in your community in Windsor, that project was $40,000 a unit. That was spent on environmental cleanup, but there was a source to pay for that. If we'd gone a mile out of town and done something else, it might have been less expensive, but we wouldn't have had that.
Yeah,
So we're trying to find the sources to deal with that cost while adding value to our downtowns, cleaning up sites that are really difficult, getting slums in place.
yeah.
So I agree that we need to have focus on the number of units, but we're bringing some other benefits that I think are also.
Oh, huge
very
community
important to
benefits.
communities.
I mean, yes. I couldn't agree more fully. Thank you. This was incredibly valuable and one that I think we'll be pondering and weighing and reviewing for the whole session probably. Anyway, thank you very much.